Welcome back. While voting by mail received outsized attention this year, a greater number of voters cast ballots in person, either during early voting or on election day. Serving these voters during a pandemic required creativity and flexibility, both in terms of policy and administratively. Election officials on our next panel found ways to serve voters in person when even being within 6 feet of other people was discouraged. Charles Stewart is the founding director of the MIT Election Data and Science Lab and co-director of the Healthy Elections Project, and he will lead the conversation. Charles, the panel is yours.
Thanks, Matt. It's really great to be moderating this panel today with four really great election officials to talk about serving voters in person. So, to introduce the panel, I guess I'd say is that what's lost oftentimes in the rush. What was lost oftentimes in the rush to ensure that voters were getting the information they needed to vote by mail for the first time this year. And as state and local jurisdictions were getting the policies and equipment down to handle this new flurry of mail, lost was the fact that a bit over half the electorate still voted in person in 2020. And actually, as an aside, and even in places that weren't predominantly voting in person, the in-person feature was nonetheless an issue. I remember giving a talk to the Washington State County election officials in the summer, where we talked about some of our line work and doing some getting a call from Gloria Guino in Washington, as Secretary Wyman mentioned today with the election day registration in Washington State. There was need to manage lines on election day and in the early voting period. So serving voters in person everywhere was and continues to be a really important issue. So election officials did all this work in a changed environment. Now, my colleague and partner in crime in the Healthy Elections Project, Nate Pursley, liked to talk this year about the challenges of persons, places, and things that were needed for elections. And in-person voting is full of all three of these things. And all manner of things in these categories were under pressure. Poll worker recruitment was a challenge. Those are the persons, the places, getting venues to vote in, maintaining old ones, recruiting new ones, and acquiring the PPE and other things that are needed to run an in-person polling site were all things that election officials had to worry about. And then on top of that, voters themselves had to figure out what they were going to do, figure out how they could vote and transact business in person and do it safely. And oftentimes they needed to figure out where they could do these things, either because they wanted to vote early, maybe for the first time, or because their polling place locally had been closed or moved, and they had to figure out what to do in that instance. So, as I mentioned this morning, voters who ended up voting in person had as good an experience qualitatively as they ever have in recent years. So that was made possible by the fact that, well, many people voted by mail, which helped take some of the pressure off of in-person voting. But this is also because of the preparations made by many election officials around the country and the nearly 1 million people who worked the polls on election day. So a lot of work went into this. And here today to talk about some of this work are four officials, state and local, who will discuss serving voters in person. We have Marcy Andino, who's the executive director of the South Carolina Election Commission. Jared Deering, who is the executive director of the Kentucky Board of Elections. Sherry Polland is the director of the Hamilton County, Ohio Board of Elections. That's the county that Cincinnati is in. And David Stafford is the supervisor of elections for Escambia County, Florida, which is the county where Pensacola is. So to start things off, I wanted to give our panel members here an opportunity to talk about what's on the top of their minds as they reflect on the needs of in-person voters in this past election. And we'll do this alphabetically, and we'll start with Marcy Andino.
Thank you, Charles, and thank you to the BPC for the opportunity to participate in this panel. I think all of the panelists would agree that, wow, what a year we all had. We saw records broken here in South Carolina, both in turnout and in record numbers of absentee ballots being cast. When it was all said and done, about 83% of voters cast their ballot either in person on election day or in person in an absentee precinct. And let me just note that we do not have early voting. We are a state that requires an excuse to vote absentee, but yet 82, 83% of voters either cast a ballot in person on election day or in an absentee precinct. So, you know, challenges are always associated with elections, and they change from year to year. And conducting an election during the midst of a pandemic presented extraordinary and a unique set of challenges. But our goal throughout 2020 was protecting voters, protecting poll workers, protecting county and state election officials who were out there on the front lines. And all at the same time, we had to make sure that voters had the opportunity to cast their ballots in an environment that was as safe as we could possibly make it. So, some of those challenges that we faced, in addition to the pandemic, of course, is changes in election laws and also lawsuits. So, we had the rules changing frequently and changing at the last minute, and everybody had to adapt quickly. Sometimes the rules today changed and the rules tomorrow were different. So that was a challenge for state and local election officials. It was a challenge for voters and for poll workers, just trying to keep up with what was going on. Some of these things were had late implementation dates, and it created uncertainty. But everybody pulled together and we were able to meet those challenges. Counties also had the challenge of recruiting poll workers and staffing in their offices to meet the demands of an increase in absentee voters. Poll workers, many of them are at that high risk age, and they just decided that they didn't want to chance it and didn't want to work. So we had a statewide effort to recruit new poll managers to be able to meet the demands on election day. Finding the PPE and disinfecting supplies that every polling place would require. We also provided new technologies to counties to reduce contact time and to allow for social distancing for voters and election workers. And we provided additional equipment, um, additional voting opportunities while following current state law. And then we had a challenge of educating not just election officials, but voters and countering the misinformation that was being circulated. So it was a lot of things with that were prefaced with the word new. And sometimes people don't like a lot of change, particularly when they're busy. But we kept throwing new things at everyone, and everybody rose to the occasion there. So it was a very, very interesting year in that respect.
Thanks, Marcy. Jared from Kentucky.
Thank you, Dr. Stewart. I appreciate it. I also like to thank Matt and the team at BPC for putting this together. I think it's been a great day watching a lot of the panels come in today. It's been really informative. Kentucky was in an interesting place. We had the capacity to be able to change our primary election, specifically the date in which we were able to hold that. We were able to push it back by over a month. And then that gave us the opportunity to be able to evaluate what other states were going through implementing a primary election during a pandemic. It was a really, honestly, I feel like I'm standing on the shoulders of a lot of my peers, seeing the things that they did well, and then trying to implement them into our state. One of the things that we did is evaluating in other states, seeing what went wrong and how we can improve on that. Some of the things that we saw were precinct locations that were unavailable, finding locations, finding poll workers, But more than that, one of the things that we were trying to accomplish is that on election day, you now have a single point of failure, right? So if something happens on election day, that's kind of it. You kind of have to roll with the punches. You can do your best to accommodate it, but it's really hard to change midstream on election day. And so some of the things that we were seeing from other states is that the polling location that they had reserved didn't open up. Poll workers that didn't show up, you had a high attrition rate of new poll workers that said they would volunteer. And all of a sudden now that location didn't open up, and now where do those voters go? How do you accommodate, midstream on election day? So some of the things that we tried to evaluate were, how do we condense the logistical mechanics of running an election? How do we keep voters safe? How do we do this in a way that gives access to the ballot? So what we really decided on is a holistic approach of the entire election. So not just looking at in-person as a whole, but expanding access to the ballot while also expanding security and transparency into the election. So at the end of the day, what we were able to do is expand absentee mail balloting. We were able to expand early voting for the first time in our state's history. And then on election day, what we tried to do is condense some of our polling locations down. And instead of concentrating into small locations, what we try to do is push the size of the location up as best we possibly could. So Jefferson County is a really good example of that. It's Louisville, it's our largest city in the state. They condensed down, for the primary at least, they condensed down to one polling location. It was at the state fairgrounds. It was 1.3 million square feet of voting space, which was absolutely incredible. Over 500 voting booths. They were able to process tens of thousands of voters on election day and do so in a way that there wasn't a line the entire day. It was really effective voting. But what we also found is it guaranteed that the polling location itself would be opened up. We could accommodate if certain poll workers didn't show up. We can just move people around within the location itself. But then what we also saw is by increasing the size of the location, we were able to safely social distance. One of the complaints we got was, you're putting all these people into one place. That's more dangerous because of COVID, not less. But it's actually the inverse. It's kind of one of those common sense things. It seems like common sense that you want distributed, but it's actually the way our precinct locations work is they're really, really small locations often. They're in a church basement. They're in a senior home. They're in these locations where if you have one large group of people that come at the same time, which we often see, now you've got a large mass of people associating together during a pandemic. I mean, it's just the last thing you want. But by increasing the scope of the voting location itself, we were able to accommodate all of the voting needs. Now, the only way that worked is because we were also able to distribute early voting and then also absentee mailing. We went from, in a normal election in Kentucky, we see about 2% of our ballots are cast by mail. And in the primary election, that was 75% of our ballots. So, I mean, just swinging that whole entire process around was an incredible heavy lift. And I am so incredibly indebted to the county clerks, the 120 county clerks that work for the Commonwealth in this process. But, you know, we didn't see a single case of community spread during our primary. And we took those lessons from the primary and moved into the general election. And one of the key things that we did is work in a bipartisan manner. We put work groups together that consisted of the governor's staff, the Secretary of State, the State Board of Elections, county clerks, and we all worked together in a bipartisan way so that the end product that we had, both parties had buy-in to that process. And I think that while we weren't immune to lawsuits, I think it definitely decreased the number of lawsuits that we had, because both party affiliations had some ownership of what that process would look like and were able to then help lift us as opposed to try to kind of peel apart at the edges.
Thanks, Jared. That was great. We turn now to Sherry and the news from Ohio.
Hi, good afternoon. I want to thank the Bipartisan Policy Center for hosting this event, and I'm honored to be here with my fellow panelists. I think in Ohio, we're fortunate that we've had some good election policy on the books for quite some time. And by that, I mean that voters have the option to choose the method they wish to cast their ballot. Voters can vote by mail. They can vote early in person, 28 days prior to Election Day, or they can vote in person at their polling place on Election Day. So those procedures and those practices have been in place for well over a decade, and I think that really helped us during this pandemic. Historically, in Hamilton County, we see about 7% of voters who choose to vote early in person, about 23% vote by mail. So that's the vast majority, 70% that vote in person on election day. Well, in planning this election, this presidential election during a global pandemic, we knew we had to sort of have our own version of flattening the curve in election administration, and that we needed to even out those methods so that we didn't overload or overburden any one process to the point where it became unmanageable. In the end, we were successful with doing that. We increased our vote by mail to 39%. Our early in person increased to 19%, which meant that only 42% voted in person on election day. So we were able to spread out our resources to accommodate all of that. And I think what's mentioned earlier, we would not have been able to do that if it wasn't for the high volume of vote by mail. I think what's important in all of this is that we tried to put processes in place that would give the voters a good voting experience, because we believed if they have a good experience while casting their ballot, they'll have confidence in the election results. And so one thing that was going around at the time that we began mailing ballots was that people lost faith in the post office. So we worked very closely with our local postmaster and other representatives to make sure that those ballots were delivered timely. And in fact, we began mailing ballots on October 6th and mailed out 157,000 of those. And most of those that were delivered locally, the voters received the very next day, almost overnight delivery service. That right away, I think, boosted people's confidence in the election, where they thought it was going to take weeks to get their ballots by mail. It did not, and they were pleasantly surprised. Something else we had to do in Ohio, we're only allowed to have one early vote center per county. And in Hamilton County, that's at our Board of Elections. Well, we knew right away it was not enough space to accommodate voters who would be appearing early in person. And so we were able to secure additional space in a facility that's on the same campus as our Board of Elections. But we doubled the size of our early in-person voting, which meant we could keep the same allocation of check-in stations and voting machines and voting booths that we had planned prior to the pandemic, and still allow voters to maintain the 6-foot social distancing as well as our staff. This again was a success. Voters were pleasantly surprised when they showed up, and many of them would bring chairs and voting chairs, and there were comments, well, I didn't even have to unfold my chair. This went so quickly. We were able to process 600 voters an hour. And overall was over 80,000 voters that came to the Board of Elections. So all of this helped to ease the process on election day for in-person voting. I think one of the biggest challenges, which was mentioned before, was recruiting poll workers. It's always a challenge every election, but during a pandemic, when the majority of your poll workers are vulnerable, it was a Herculean effort. To again sort of mention another phrase we like to associate with living through this pandemic, I think it applies to elections, in that we're all in this together. That was the feeling of our community when it came to recruiting poll workers. It wasn't just the Board of Elections. Businesses gave their employees the day off. The media pushed the need for poll workers. The Ohio Supreme Court issued an order allowing attorneys to receive continuing legal education credits for working the polls. And then other professional organizations followed suit, and we suddenly had lawyers and accountants and social workers signing up. And we also had many of our experienced poll workers stick with us, even though they were vulnerable, because they felt such a sense of civic duty. And in the end, it worked well. We not only had enough poll workers to keep our full complement of polling locations that we had previously planned. All of those positions were staffed, but we had an additional 100 trained election officials that we had on reserve, and they reported to our Board of Elections that morning, and then we sent them out to locations that maybe had no shows in the morning or may have been experiencing long lines. So in the end, it was a community effort that we came together and administered this election. And I've never been prouder to to be a elections official, not only with our team, but also the election officials across the country.
Great, thanks. And we'll clean up with Dave Stafford down on the Gulf.
Good afternoon. Well, thanks for the opportunity. I'm going to be uncharacteristically brief. At least I'm going to try. We'll see how this goes. Because much has already been said. I could reiterate much of what the three panelists before me have said. But so a couple of different. Of course, we all shared the challenge of dealing with COVID. We were, you may recall, back in March, Ohio and Florida actually had the presidential primary slated at the same day, March 17th, and the weekend before. I think it was the weekend before. Ohio decided to postpone theirs, and we went through with ours. So we were sort of at the leading edge, unfortunately, of running elections in the middle of a pandemic. We learned a lot from that, and then we had the luxury of having a pretty long break between that and the August regular primary. So a lot of other states went, and so we learned a lot from them. And then, of course, we had yet another opportunity to prepare for the big one, the general election. So we learned a lot throughout that. A couple of additional challenges that we had that I don't know that Ohio and Kentucky had to deal with 2 hurricanes, but those impacted us both in polling locations, and then we had to change our schedule during the second hurricane as it related to early voting, which is never fun, having to adjust those as we go. And then the other thing that hasn't got a whole lot of attention is that about half the state, about half of the counties were sued. Now, it wasn't right before, but it was back in about 2018 over language access. And long story short, what resulted was many counties in the state for the first time had to deal with bilingual balloting materials, including the ballot itself. And what that resulted for us here personally, as well as I know most of my colleagues, was what would normally be a 1-card ballot front and back then became a 2-card ballot. And in addition, things like these lengthy constitutional amendments that are lengthy anyway, then you double the language, and that becomes even lengthier. So those all have impacts, as you could imagine, not the least of which the time in the booth. And so those are a couple of additional challenges that we had to deal with. Much like Ohio, we believe we were well positioned because of the structure of how we do our voting. Now, we've had 20 years of been the punching bag for the nation and the world. And we benefit, I think, quite frankly, from low expectations. Even though it's kind of a dirty little secret, we're pretty good at running elections over the course of the last decade or so. But that's fine. We don't wear that chip on our shoulder too much. But the structure was such that we're well positioned for something like this, because we have 3 distinct ways to vote in Florida. And we don't care, as we always say, we don't care which method you choose, just choose one and make sure that you vote. We've had no excuse vote by mail for the better part of 18 years. We've had our current form of early voting in some form or fashion since about 2006. And then we've of course, have election day. Just to kind of give you an idea of how that has shifted just in the 20 years since the infamous 2000 election. In that election, these are just the Escambia County numbers. You had about 86% of the votes that were cast during that 12-hour period. Actually, it was more than 12 hours, but that 12-hour period on election day. Fast forward to the 2020 election, that was only 23% of the votes cast. Now, that wasn't as drastic, I know, as some states, the change, but ours was, at least here locally, and I think the rest of the state, is sort of that share continued to diminish as far as election day votes cast. The poll workers, of course, was a challenge. It was an interesting story. We had a big challenge during the presidential primary, because again, it was new and people were freaking out, understandably. So we were losing a lot of last minute poll workers. I remember talking to my colleague in Palm Beach County. She lost, I think, a quarter of her poll workers over the course of the weekend before the election, up to an election day. But again, because of some of these efforts by election offices, as well as third-party groups and campaigns, we actually had a surplus of people that ended up for the general election willing to serve as poll workers, which is something we hadn't seen in quite some time. People really responded to those messages of, hey, you want to help? This is a great way to help. We're actually ended up turning people away, saying, we've got enough people. We'll keep your name here if we run into an emergency. But that's something that we haven't experienced here in quite some time. And I guess the last thing I would say is, the security aspect was something, and again, I think that somewhat gets diminished, the cybersecurity, because you've had all this other noise around, but the fact that that dominated this space for the last 3.5, 4 years. Since critical infrastructure and all the news came out about what happened in 2016, that was front and center. But it was really the fact that you didn't have mass, some of the things that were feared, like voter registration, electronic poll books, people not being in the poll books, and having these great disruptions where websites going down on election night. You just didn't see a lot of that. What was feared, I think. In the lead up, and quite frankly, we needed a lot of preparation. So those are sort of my initial takeaways. And again, I don't want to say everything that's been said before. So thanks.
Thanks, David. Just moving on, but actually, for most of this conversation, I think it's the motto here for this group was "Let her rip." But I wanted actually to pick on Marcy just for a little bit, because I think that this is a panel on serving the in-person voter, and I think of any state in the country, one of the states that had the purest example of in-person voting on election day was South Carolina, as Marcy was mentioning in her remarks, and I'd be curious to how did you do it, Marcy? How did the county boards deal with it? And is there a sense, just sort of how was it dealt with? And is there a sense that, we got through this and we did okay?
There's definitely a sense that, yes, we got through it and we did okay. Before the general election, after the primary, there was a huge increase in requests for absentee ballots by mail. And as we got closer to the general election and absentee for the general started, we saw that people who had originally thought they were going to vote by mail made that shift, and they wanted to vote in-person absentee. So we had lines for in-person absentee. And keep in mind, we don't have early voting. We don't have vote centers. So it was the county registration office or any satellite office that they could open. So many counties opened satellite or extension offices. They looked to large facilities like coliseums and high school gymnasiums so that they could socially distance everyone. Our General Assembly saw the need and the desire of voters to cast absentee ballots, and they added a state of emergency reason, which basically opened it up so any voter was now eligible to vote by absentee. So with the increase in the number of locations, we were able to get more people through the absentee process in a timely manner. And it was very much a build it and they will come type situation. The counties that had the highest percentage of absentee votes were the ones that had the more extension offices. And statewide, our absentee turnout numbers were 38%. But in counties that had a lot of satellite locations, we saw counties with over 50%, like 52% or right around 50%. So it was very popular. Voters didn't seem to mind standing in line to be able to vote absentee. So we knew in order to have shorter lines on election day, we had to have a lot of people going through the in-person absentee process. And we only had lines on election day early in the morning. So those people that were there when the polls opened.
And this is, and you mentioned something that I'd like to throw open to the rest of the panelists, and it has to do with people requesting absentee ballots. I mean, a number of states, I got the sense that a lot of voters, especially in places where voting by mail hadn't been so popular, that many people were requesting ballots almost as a insurance policy, and then deciding to vote in person later on. How did one, I mean, did y'all experience this? And then number two, assuming you did, what effect did that have on the ability to run, in-person voting for those who didn't take out insurance?
Maybe I can take that to start that off. One of the things that we did for the general is we literally, when you applied for your absentee ballot, we created an online portal. One of the first things it did is it told the voter that if you apply for an absentee ballot, this is your method of voting. What we didn't want is people, because we saw some of that in the primary election where I literally had people calling me saying, hey, I applied for an absentee ballot just because I wanted to see that it wasn't going to show up so I can go on Facebook and say all these things about it. And it showed up and it was great, but now I'm going to vote in person. And so, what we were trying to do is encourage people to pick the way, kind of like David was saying, is, we didn't really care which way you voted, just pick that way and then accomplish it and make sure you were as effective as possible. And so one of the things we really did was messaging. In the general election, we spent over $1 million trying to coordinate voters. We were on TV, radio, print ads, social media, just trying to explain to voters what their options were and explaining to them how to effectively do what that option was going to be, whether it was in person or by absentee mail. But without the absentee mail process, it would have just absolutely overrun the in-person. And I think, honestly, what Election Day ended up being was a safety net for all the voters that either just couldn't find the way to apply for an absentee ballot, whether it was a conditional problem or a philosophical problem. But it also, in the general election, the presidential general election, it's high propensity, or there's a high propensity of low propensity voters, right? So what you end up with is all these voters that don't vote in a normal election, that in off cycles, now all of a sudden they're voting, and usually they're the most low information voters. So they're showing up on election day because they just didn't realize what their options were. So making sure that we were able to distribute enough of the load off of the other methods made sure that election day was accessible for voters that might just not have understood what their options were.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Anyone else?
Yeah, Charles, we make it pretty easy in the state of Florida and have for some time to request vote by mail ballots. The other thing that we have is the ability for a voter, actually the default, if you just say, hey, I want to be a vote by mail voter, is for 2 full election cycles. So if somebody were to request a ballot today, by the default method, they would receive their ballots for all elections in which they're eligible through the 2024 election cycle. And so that, that's got its challenges in and of itself to make sure your lists are up to date. But, we're about to join ERIC, or have joined ERIC. And so hopefully that's going to improve that process as well. The other thing I think that really, sometimes I think we may be a little hard on ourselves in terms like, in addition to voter fraud, but suppression and things like that. I personally believe that a lot of times they get overused. And I have to say that, if you look at the ability for people to register to vote and the ability for people to cast a ballot, I would argue that we've never been in a position where that's easier to do either. Now, again, that's not saying that there's not ways to make improvements, and there's not pockets of challenges and problems, but overall, if you want to register to vote, you can register pretty easily in most places. And if you want to cast a ballot, you arguably have more options than you ever have in order to fulfill that wish.
Right. Great. Thanks.
I think in Ohio, something that affected voters choosing to vote by mail and then changing their mind later as it got closer to November 3rd had a lot to do with our extended primary. So as David mentioned before, in Ohio, we were scheduled to have in-person voting for our primary March 17th. And then late in the evening on March 16th, the Director of Public Health for Ohio ordered all of the polling locations to be closed. And in the end, we ended up with finishing the election with an all vote by mail election. It was extended until April 28th, but primarily everyone had to vote by mail. In-person voting was limited to voters who were homeless or voters with disabilities. So at that time, people really struggled to get their by mail ballot because they had to fill out an application. And we were not permitted to mail an application to the voter unless the voter requested an application. So many voters struggled through that vote by mail process. So while they were going through that in the spring, they went ahead and submitted an application for the general, thinking, well, I'm going to get this in early, I'll have it in ahead of time. We received many, from many voters, 2 applications in the spring, one for the primary, and then at the same time, they were requesting for the general. And then throughout the summer months, when, you know, we all as a society were learning more and more about COVID, we started to feel more comfortable going to the grocery store, things like that. I think those people then felt more comfortable going back to their traditional way of voting and voting in person. So we did have a number of voters who requested a ballot by mail and then decided to show up in person. We were able to accommodate it both early in person as well as on election day. I think one thing that did help is to keep those that requested a by mail ballot and then stay committed to the process was the ability to track that process on our website. Mm-hmm. You know, they could log in, see that when we processed their application, when we mailed their ballot, and then when they returned their ballot, they could see that their ballot had been returned and processed and accepted for counting. So I think that helped.
Right, thanks. Let's turn our attention to poll workers, and I think it was Sherry talked a little bit about all the groups that you know, stepped forward to you know, to ensure that poll workers, you know, there were poll workers there to accommodate all of the voters. Let's focus on this just for a couple of minutes. You know, back in March and April, there was a lot of freaking out about the possibility of not having poll workers, and as I recall, the infamous situation in Milwaukee was driven largely by last-minute poll worker problems, and you know, the National Guard was called out and all of that, and so you know, a number of groups in society mobilized to help meet the demand. Looking back on it now, what have we learned from that process? Is this a sustainable process? Should we it's almost like, should we have a crisis every 2 to 4 years to get new blood into the, I see no, okay, no new blood. What about the role of private groups? I know there were large national groups and state groups that were recruiting, et cetera. So, you know, we don't have a whole lot of time, but kind of what worked best and what maybe didn't work so well in terms of trying to backfill the vacancies that you were sensing in your poll workers.
One of the things that Kentucky did that I thought was really effective for us was, you know, one of the things we tried to tell people is that, like, it's not just about a lack of enough poll workers. So in Kentucky, you need 4 poll workers to run 1 precinct. If you replace one of those poll workers, it's not a problem because the new one that you bring in will norm to the behaviors of the other 3. But what happens when you replace 3 of the 4 or 4 of the 4, right? Now there's no institutional knowledge for those individuals to work off of. So one of the things that we tried to do is, because we had implemented early voting for several weeks prior to the election, we tried to get clerks to actually work with poll workers in getting them ingrained into the process during early voting, bringing them in, training them, evaluating them, making sure that, you know, because not everyone, unfortunately, is prepared or, you know, is reasonable enough to be a poll worker. Sometimes they bring their own, you know, philosophies, and you want them following the rules and the regulations and the laws, and sometimes they don't want to do that. So it's just important enough for the poll worker to get training before election day when it was game time, but it was also important for the clerk to be able to evaluate those individuals. And what we found is, by the time we got to election day, it was great. You know, these people had multiple days of training. They had a good basis of understanding of what was expected from them, what they needed to expect from the voters. And in general, we had a really positive response from both voters and poll workers because of it.
Charles, I'd say another sort of offshoot of this, at least for us, was necessity. You had to change the way you did your training because, you know, again, particularly early on, doing that kind of in-person training. So you had really smaller classes. We ended up doing part of it online. We had tried that when that was kind of the new fad back in the mid 2000s when everybody was. When we initially did it, we just didn't have a great experience with it. So we kind of abandoned that and went back to in-person. But this forced our hand, of course, so we had to do some of it online. And I think that expectation is that, I mean, we learned some things that out of necessity that I think we're going to take moving forward. One of the things we did is we trained our poll workers in their individual precincts. So they trained as a team. We had not done that before. Sometimes it just sort of happened accidentally, but we deliberately did that in smaller groups, which takes a heck of a lot more resources. But at the end of the day, we think that it benefited everybody, the poll workers, the election officials, as well as the voters themselves. So I think that's going to be an interesting offshoot to see how those training methods that were employed out of necessity become part of the norm moving forward.
Good. Well, after people, there's the places, and as I mentioned this morning, at least nationwide, according to what voters were telling us, they were less likely to vote in a church or a school this year than they were in the past. And certainly from the press, everyone was hot on voting in Fenway Park here in Boston, and other really kind of great sporting arenas. So what was it like for y'all? Were you experiencing the loss of these churches and schools? Were there new types of places that came forward? Or did you find new places that may in fact be sustainable in future? Or will we be going back to church basements and kind of small cramped spaces after the pandemic is over?
I'll start. We were very fortunate in Hamilton County that we only lost a handful of polling places due to COVID. Of course, prior to the scheduled in-person primary, we had moved polling places out of senior living facilities. So we did have to find new locations for those. But as soon as our primary was over, we reached out to our polling locations, through a letter, letting them know that there would be in-person voting on November 3rd, and we would still need their location. And we also let them know all the safety measures we were going to put in place to keep everyone safe at that location. And after that communication went out, we only lost a couple of polling places, which we were really grateful for, because I think it's one thing I know I've learned is voters do not like it when you move their polling places. They get accustomed to going to that same church where they know the poll workers, it's in their community. So we were very fortunate that we did not have to move any of those polling locations.
Mm-hmm. Great. Anyone else want to jump in on this one? I guess not. I guess we're good. We're good on polling locations. So, we're getting close to wrapping up. I just want to kind of one general question for the group, and then we'll have some final thoughts. So, what you saw in this past election, is it the way we're going to be going in the future? And that is to say, do we think that that offloading so much of voting from election day is the way voting is going to be happening in your states and communities in the future? Is this a one-off? Are you waiting and seeing what voters are going to be doing? It seems to me as an outsider that there's now not as much uncertainty about the future as there was of voting during COVID, but there must be some uncertainty about how voters are going to respond now that some of them have been voting by mail now. So how are you thinking about moving forward in terms of balancing the need to maintain traditional or non-traditional in-person sites at the same time that voters may, at least some of them may want to continue voting by mail?
I think for us, we're going to focus. So unfortunately, when we changed our laws around this last election about the general and the primary, there were emergency regulations, and so those emergency regulations went away as soon as those elections were over. What that means for future elections, I mean, once a voter changes their behavior, you tend to see that they tend to continue that behavior on. So I definitely expect that more and more voters will take advantage of the excuse-based absentee voting that we have. A lot of our voters already fall under the excuse eligibility that we have, but honestly, I think what we're planning on doing is concentrating on messaging again, educating voters. I think understanding that there are multiple ways to vote and just being effective in that way. What we try to do is tell voters to make a plan to vote and then effectuate that plan. Make sure you can be successful in that type of voting. And so I think we'll continue to do that, making sure people have an opportunity to vote in person if that's the way they choose to do so, and making that as effective and safe and secure as possible. If it's by absentee mail, that we do the same thing there. We're going to try and push our legislature to see if we can get early voting to be a permanent fixture in Kentucky elections. But, in the interim, we're going to continue to do voter education.
Good. So anyone else on whether this is the wave of the future, or is it wait and see about what comes next?
I think when you give voters choices, it's tough to take them back away once they, at least that's what we've seen here in Florida. And I guess the last thing I would say is that, it's going to be naive of me to say, but now is the time to start making these policy changes, right, through the regular method of policy making through the legislative and executive branches versus this rush. I mean, part of it was out of necessity in dealing with the situation, but a lot of it ended up in the judicial branch. And my personal opinion is that's not the way to do election law and election policy. Now we're just on the other side of, or about to be on the other side of a presidential election. We've got now is the time for legislatures and executives to and local election officials and state election officials to get together and say, okay, what are the lessons we've learned? What are the things that were put in place, whether through executive order or through a judicial decree that we think that benefit the voters ultimately, and let's take this opportunity now to do policy making the correct way. And so you're in a position to, when you get to the 2022 cycle and the 2024 cycle, it's not this patchwork of last minute urgent situations that create this pseudo chaos that doesn't benefit anybody, even if it's well intentioned. I know, again, that's naive, but here's to holding out hope that that policymaking process can begin or continue in the correct way. So we're in a position where we can effectively carry out the elections moving forward.
Well, we have about 1 minute left, and I wanted to give everybody 15 seconds to say what's on their mind, if there's anything we left out. And I'm going to go in reverse alphabetical order. And actually, David, anything else you want to add? He's over and out. Sherry.
Just real quick, I think one thing I know we need to focus on a little bit is educating voters on how elections are administered. Not just their options for voting, but what happens that election night is an unofficial count, and the official count comes this many days later, and what election officials are doing during that time frame. So I think that's something definitely we want to work on, is just educating voters not only how to vote, but then how their vote is counted.
Great education. Jared, you're 15.
I think the one thing that was accomplished in this election is voters had an insight into the inner workings of how elections work for the first time. I mean, so many voters think that, to do a Harry Potter theme, that, they're house elves. It's all magic. It all happens behind the scenes, right? That you show up on one day and everything's there. You get the correct ballot face. You can vote for the person you're trying to vote for. that process takes months and months of preparation and thousands of hours of work from county clerks and volunteers and poll workers, and then hundreds of hours after the election as well to make sure it's a fair, secure election that was well run. And everything that I saw from Kentucky and across the nation is that election administrators did an amazing job in this last election. And I'm hoping that the voters take with that into the next election cycle some of those ideas of just how hard election workers work, especially at the county level. You know, so many of my county clerks worked through COVID conditions that were just absolutely incredible. And I am so incredibly grateful to the job that they did to make sure that we had an successful election in the Commonwealth.
Thanks. And Marcy, you have negative 15 seconds.
Negative 15. Okay. The success of an election can be measured in different ways, and it all depends on who you ask. It's whether their candidate won or how long they stood in line. But I think for this year, that there was no major spike in COVID cases after the election was a win for all of us.
Great, thanks. And I think our colleagues can now see why elections were so successful, or the people on watching can see why elections were so successful with a panel like this helping to run them. And so with this, we have a break, and I'd like to thank the panelists for a great hour, and I'll turn it back over to the BPC folks.